Welcome back to Keep Your Hebrew. Today I wanted to talk about how Hebrew Discourse Analysis, or DA, connects with Bible exposition. I define Bible exposition as preaching and teaching that flows from what the Bible actually says, majoring on what a passage majors on and minoring on what it minors on. I believe that Hebrew DA is a significant aid to our preparation for sermons and Bible studies. And the crux of this video is showing you a brief example of how that might practically look like in the week-to-week grind of pastoral ministry. I'm also going to show you some ways in which DA helps bring out the salient points of a given passage. Before I do that, I'm going to engage with a practical problem. DA in its most rigorous form can be pretty tough to practice on a regular basis. It might be so time-consuming and difficult that people abandon DA altogether. Here's a case in point. This is a DA that I had to produce for one of my classes. I can see how this might be really helpful and essential even if you were writing a technical commentary on a book of the Bible and you really needed to go into every little detail of the text. I can also see why this is necessary in an academic setting such as a seminary, where you need to show your working in a format that is clear so that your instructor can assess whether you understand what you've been taught or not. I can also see a kind of wax on, wax off value to doing something like this, because in this sort of super detailed analysis, your exegetical muscles and instincts are being trained. What I'm not too sure about is whether this level of DA is doable or sustainable in the context of week-to-week pastoral ministry when you have so many other things to do on top of preparing sermons and Bible studies. So what I'm doing in this video is offering a tentative proposal, an 80-20 approach to DA that enables preachers and teachers to glean the benefits of DA for sermon and study preparation, while avoiding the burnout and paralysis by analysis that can sometimes happen when you start paying attention to every single tree in the proverbial forest. So here's how this approach works. It centers around a simple flowing of the Hebrew text that you can scribble on, and you can make rough notes in the margins. I took about 30 to 45 minutes to create that flow, as opposed to the 4 or 5 hours I spent working on the DA I showed you earlier. A lot of the time saved actually comes from time saved on formatting, time saved also on not having to deal with immediately recognizable things like regular viictals and such, time saved on just saying what you see instead of having to track down what technical term a scholar uses to describe a certain discourse pattern, time saved on not having to put every single thing on paper, just what is relatively salient. This is 3 to 4 hours that you save over the course of many weeks, and this translates to more ministry in a way that doesn't necessarily or significantly reduce the quality of your sermon and study preparation. That brings me to the meat of this video. So how does this method still enable us to see important things in the text so that we can be responsible expositors of Scripture? Firstly, this text still enables us to see mainline and offline relationships. I'm operating on the basis that mainline clauses are just continuing the narrative or dialogue and are not as salient, while offline clauses, because they've been subordinated for a certain reason indicated by a conjunction or a discourse marker, show that the author is trying to highlight something, a change in pace of the narrative, a change in the logic flow, something that the author wants us to sit up and pay attention to. That's what offline is. How have I indicated that in this flowchart? You'll notice that the most indented statements I have highlighted either in yellow or in green. And the purpose of this is so that in one glance, you can just tell what the most offline clause is. In other words, what the author considers to be very salient. And the purpose of that for preparation would be to allow you to emphasize the points that the author himself emphasizes. Let me show you an example of this in Jeremiah chapter 1 verse 19. And they will fight against you, but they will not prevail against you, for I am with you, declares the Lord, to deliver you. And so you can see that the accent falls on these two clauses. This first clause introduced by the key conjunction, and then this infinitive construct that shows the purpose of the Lord being with Jeremiah to deliver him. Next up, this flowchart also shows you relationships between clauses. Referring back to this same verse, you can just note on this diagram that key establishes a relationship of grounds with the preceding statements. So previously we see that Jeremiah's adversaries will fight against him, but they will not prevail against him. Why is that? This key establishes the grounds for that. It's because the Lord is with Jeremiah to deliver him. And so just because it's not in a table doesn't mean that you can't mark that relationship of grounds in your own way, in a way that you can see straight away just by looking at it. Thirdly, you can also see how different clauses put focus on certain elements in the clause. What do I mean by focus? Focus is when normal word order is turned on its head in order to put the focus on something, in order to emphasize something. What do I mean by that? Let's go back to our trusty verse 19, where there's a lot going on. So if you read this woodenly, it actually says, "For with you I am." And you can see that the predicate has been pushed in front of the subject, which would not normally be the case in regular word order. What that means is that the with you-ness of God, the fact that God is with Jeremiah, is being highlighted here. This is salient. And so in one glance, you can see everything that's going on without the table being too busy, without having to put too much in front of you. Just one glance and you can see what's important. That's not the only way to show focus. So you can also have discourse markers like hine and other things. And what you then do is you mark it in a color of your choice. I have chosen cyan. So when I look at something that's highlighted in cyan, I know that there's something interesting going on and I need to pay closer attention to that in my preparation. Last but not least, we also see important repetitions in this flowchart that we can use to generate our outlines, for example. So if you look over here, I've highlighted verse 4 in purple. This is a secondary marked citation formula that shows the beginning of dialogue. And the word of the Lord came to me saying. You see this again in verse 11, which I've also highlighted, and then in verse 13. So again, in one glance, with your own choice of colors, you can make repetition very clear. And that then allows you to order your sermon in a way that also coheres with the order and structure of the passage. You can use the discourse markers and the sort of boundary markers in a passage to your advantage using this method. It's not just phrases that can be repeated, it's also individual words. So I've chosen one word to illustrate what I'm trying to say. It's the root Natan. So over here it reads, "A prophet to the nations I have appointed you." I've made you. It shows up in verse 9. Behold, I have put my words in your mouth. And it shows up again in verse 18. And I indeed, behold, I have made you today into a fortified city. So by turning the font color to red, I've been able to see in one glance that, oh, this word Natan has been repeated 3 times. And what's the effect of that? First of all, I want to point out that if you were looking at an English translation, you wouldn't have seen that at all. You would have seen the English gloss, either something like made or put or appointed. But in the Hebrew, you can see that Natan is repeated 3 times. This repetition is meant to convey the fact that the Lord is the one who is fortifying Jeremiah, who is calling Jeremiah, who's equipping Jeremiah for prophetic ministry, and is additional grounds for him to have confidence in the Lord and not to fear man. So it's things like that that, this method is able to foreground for you. That's not all. You can also figure out a way to make phonological repetition obvious. So what I want to use to illustrate that is the 3 pairs of infinitive constructs at the end of chapter 1, verse 10. Listen to this. Lintosh v'lintots. Ulaha-avid v'laha-ros. Livnot v'lintoa. Now, isn't that interesting? Can you hear the repetition of the sounds? So not only is that sequence highlighted in yellow to show that it's offline and therefore salient, there's also that phonological repetition that emphasizes that something significant is going on here. And when we trace the flow of logic, we'll see that these lamets indicate purpose. What is the purpose of the Lord's appointment of Jeremiah on this day to the nations and to the kingdoms? It is to drive away and pull down, to exterminate and to tear down, to build and to plant. So in summary, what does this method allow you to do? This method is an 80-20 way of doing Hebrew DA that lends itself to identifying what is really salient in a passage that needs to be focused on. By 80-20, I mean you put in 20% of the resources, but you get 80% or more of the payoff that you would usually get. And that's a pretty good deal. In the rigors of pastoral ministry, a method like this might prove useful. So I'm tentatively proposing this for your consideration. If you have any thoughts or comments on what I've said, please let me know. Please leave a message or leave a comment, and I'd love to discuss these issues with you further. Thanks for listening, and this has been Keep Your Hebrew.